What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. We are going to start with Goliath Thanos today, which has become a genuine meta staple at this point. This is one of the most popular decks in the game at a high level, and that is because its mixture of power and reactive tech makes it basically the kind of deck that is in every game. There are extremely powerful draws in this list, like of course Mind Stone draws are incredible, but there are also just plenty of normal games where you're able to play the part of a normal ongoing deck and just curve your way up to a Wiccan, do something stupid, and generally take advantage of the vast amount of energy cheat that you have in this deck. It's not just that you are a Wiccan deck, you are also a Mockingbird deck. You cheat energy on Thanos. There are so many different ways to do it that your low roll is basically playing as a normal curve out ongoing list, which is totally fine. This is a deck that has high rolls that are above a normal list, mid rolls that are above a normal list, and low rolls that are about at a normal list. This is a deck that defines this current metagame and will define a lot of the conversation that we have around other decks, because a lot of the choices that they make with that 12th tech card in their lists are going to be relative to this. You're going to see Enchantress, you're going to see Killmonger, you're going to see Afflict decks, and a lot of that is because of the prevalence of this list. This iteration of Scream is a great example of what I mean when I talk about the ways in which people are adapting to this metagame. Scream is obviously a powerful card on her own, extremely more powerful in the context of so many decks playing Sam Wilson Captain America, and a very, very strong card just in terms of scalers. The deck itself is actually able to be pared down to fit in a massive amount of tech. You have Killmonger for the Thanos matchup. You have Red Guardian, which I will say, a bit of a flex slot with me with the recently nerfed Rocket and Groot, RG and RG competing for that slot. I've opted for Red Guardian. I don't think anything is wrong with putting Rocket and Groot in here instead. Now, there's also a Shang-Chi, there is also a Lady Deathstrike. This is a deck that does not lack for interaction. You are moving your opponent's stuff around. You are playing large and relevant scalers, and then you are finishing the game with whatever tech card is relevant to the matchup at hand. That means that you are very well set up to handle a large amount of what the metagame can throw at you. You can customize as needed. If you feel like your Scream isn't doing enough, you can get rid of the Red Guardian and put in something that works better with the Scream, like a Stegron. You still have the ability to curve the whole way up the curve with just proccing Scream every turn, but you don't always need it because you also have Sam and, of course, Kraven that work well together in terms of getting power on the board. This is a deck that starts snowballing on turn 2 and doesn't stop until the game is over, and it can afford to play a lot of incredibly relevant tech cards. A deck that makes a lot of sense into both of those matchups a decent amount of the time is going to be Afflict. Now, there are two major styles of Afflict, and we're going to start with talking about the one that I identify as Explosive Afflict. This is the one splashing High Evolutionary in order to create final turn boards that involve a 0-cost Abomination, a 1-cost Miles Morales, maybe a giant Ajax, things of that nature. Now, this is a very powerful thing to be doing. There are a lot of upsides in playing a deck like this against Thanos, not least of which is being a Cassandra Nova deck, but also this is just a deck that is very reasonable into any deck that fills up the board because it makes Hazmat such an unbelievably powerful card. Now, there is a risk when you're playing against Thanos that you get Super Skrull pop down on you, and this deck originally sprung up as a Luke Cageless way to play this kind of archetype. However, in my experience, I have vastly preferred just playing the Luke Cage version, and then if I'm worried my opponent is going to Super Skrull me, which is mostly just Thanos decks at this point, I just don't play the Luke Cage unless I absolutely have to. And that is where we get to list number 2, which is just normal Ajax. The power of Afflict as an archetype has always been that the Afflict cards sort of double as soft tech cards. And what I mean by that is, like, Hazmat is not Killmonger, but it has a similar effect in that it's good against a lot of small stuff. Man-Thing is not Killmonger, but it has a similar effect. It takes a lane that's full of a lot of small stuff and it makes you win that lane. US Agent is far from being Shang-Chi, but in a pinch, it can be. It takes big stuff and it makes them smaller. And I think that that is sort of the hidden power of decks like this, is that they've always had access to that kind of thing. This is a deck that does not look like it actually has answers to a bunch of stuff, but because of the power of those cards, there are a bunch of situations that it gets to just free roll a really good card against. And that is what makes it so powerful. Luke Cage, being able to actually play him, is just very solid right now. He's great against Scream decks. If anyone is still playing Rocket and Groot, he is great there. He is generally great also against other decks like the previous Afflict deck. So if I had to choose one Afflict list, I do think the classic one is better, but there is some genuine thought that has to go into this. Like, you can't just auto play out your Luke Cages. You have to genuinely worry about a Super Skrull blowing you out every time. Clog is a very powerful archetype in the current metagame. It has the typical weaknesses that Clog tends to have, a general lack of being able to beat stuff like Killmonger or Misery, but it is a genuinely solid list right now, especially when we're talking about both Thanos decks and like normal ongoing decks that are going to reasonably fill up the board and really don't want to see stuff like this. Clog is extremely powerful. The good draws with this deck are almost impossible to lose with unless you're opponent just really guesses a lot of things correctly. It's a very strong deck that has some fairly telegraphed, but not necessarily the easiest to beat plays on like turn 4 with Titania and Goblins and things of that nature. It's doing powerful stuff. There are people playing Annihilus, which hard counters you. There are people playing Killmonger, which you really don't like to see. There are people playing Misery, which you also really don't like to see. There's plenty of people playing stuff that moves around. A lot of stuff to talk about in that context. It's not the world's greatest Clog meta, but a lot of that gets made up for by the fact that you just beat the living hell out of Thanos, and that is a very good matchup to have a very favorable matchup into. It's a very, very kind of hit or miss world for this deck, but when you hit, you're winning a lot. The issue is you know you're winning, and your opponent also knows you're winning. This is a deck that's going to win a lot of 2-cubers. Wanted to talk about a couple of alt builds for the top decks here. Normally, I would move these to later or maybe not put them on here, but I think they are quite good, and I don't want to just sort of talk about them as alt builds to decks, but talk about them as decks in their own right and sort of compare and contrast to the other builds that they are being built around. This is, of course, a more normal Thanos list, less invested in ongoing, and what this deck does is be a little better into Killmonger. It's obviously not amazing into Killmonger, but it is going to be meaningfully better because the ongoing Thanos list is so heavily invested in board-wide buffs like Spectrum and Blue Marvel, and a lot of that does mean that you are relying on the actual points that come from your stones. You are also playing things like Goliath and Dazzler that are just really not good if you're not filling the board up with stones. And so you end up with a deck playing a much more normal game plan, just ramping stuff out, being Thanos, doing stupid things. That's what this deck is trying to do. And by virtue of that, you end up a little less vulnerable to a fairly popular tech strategy that is going to be seeing a lot of play against you. This is a just baseline strong deck. I think in terms of average power per game, it is going to be lower than the other Thanos list. The other Thanos list just has some real ability to use those stones to create power on the board that this list lacks. But in terms of overall resiliency, I do think this list gains a little bit of points. The same goes for Scream. You can do a lot in the Scream shell. You can hyper customize it to beat specific metagames, and at the top of Infinite, you are often rewarded for doing so. But I do think that it's worth pointing out that you can just play normal Scream and it'll be fine. This is a deck that thrives when combo decks are sort of out of the metagame, and right now that is absolutely the case. It might not seem like it, but from every stat tracker I've looked at, and also just kind of my own experience, Discard is not as good of a deck as people think it is. People think it is a very good deck because it is a deck that is mostly uninteractable on its good draws. But I think it's actually much closer to Clog in terms of matchup spread and how it looks than it is to something like a legitimately overpowered combo deck like Move Bounce used to be. This is a deck that is one that thrives when stuff like Discard and Mr. Negative are not popular. Because Scream is so good at being a mid-range deck, the lower the point ceiling of the metagame is, the better it is at operating within those constraints. And so you're really going to sort of hit or miss with this one as well. Because if you are playing against a ton of ongoing Thanos, like they can maybe just go over the top of you, and maybe you actually do feel stupid for not being the Killmonger version with like Lady Deathstrike and whatnot. But I think into like a fairly average metagame, I find it hard to believe that you can do much better than just this kind of basic standard Scream. I think Scream is one of the most powerful cards in the entire game right now. And if you are below Infinite, I highly encourage you to just play a Scream deck up to Infinite. I think it is going to be probably the easiest path that you have. Pinballing off of that to Kahori, the most recent card in Marvel Snap. Yes, she has seen some play in the Thanos list, and yes, I strongly suspect that she will continue to see play in Thanos, but if you don't want to play a Kahori Thanos list, this is a perfectly acceptable alternative. Now, if you don't own Sam Wilson, you can absolutely cut him for a Werewolf by Night, and that is a very viable thing to do courtesy of Yo Woody. Now, this is a deck that I think is better with the Sam Wilson, but like that's a little bit cheating, right? Like, of course I do. It's Sam Wilson. He's the guy right now. That's who the metagame is about. That's what the metagame is about. And so while he is actually a little bit replaceable here, I do think it'll meaningfully impact your win rate most likely. I will say that what this deck does very, very well is be a compelling and straightforward deck that has really powerful nut draws. Another note is that if you are going to get a Sam Wilson in here, you might benefit from cutting Rocket and Groot and putting in a Maria Hill. That is a very viable alternative also from Yo Woody. Again, I do think this version of the deck is a little bit stronger. When I checked the stats, they backed me up on this. And also, you know, I think it's hard for me to ever believe that cutting Sam Wilson is the objective right decision. The deck manages to output a large amount of points. It manages to do so in ways that allow it to play reasonable tech cards. This is your classic Shang-Chi Juggernaut mid-range list. One really big problem, though, is we just talked about Killmonger, right? Like, this deck doesn't beat that card. This is a deck that cares a lot about making demons. It cares a lot about Kate Bishop stuff. You do not beat Killmonger against basically any reasonable deck. This is the Surfer list that I incorrectly attributed to Smiles last time. It's actually Heart of the Cards' list. I believe at the moment he is playing a, Speed over Sage. I just don't trust that. Like, I think that this is a very, very functional and good Surfer list that does a lot of powerful stuff. I think that if you are interested in just a point ceiling deck, this deck can do it. And I think that it is just a deck that has a wide ability to tech into the metagame. One of the things that's really interested me, though, is the lack of Killmonger inclusions. I suspect that if you want to play Killmonger right now, the cut is Rocket and Groot, but I really do value having Rocket and Groot in this deck because it's a great carrier of buffs and a great redistributor of power. I know a lot of people are cutting it, but I am loath to do so. I do really want to get a Killmonger in here, though, because it does seem like a free thing for us to do. There's so many good things. The problem is, in order to play all the twos, right? Like, in order to have our lanes full for Sage and all of that stuff, we're playing a Kate Bishop. And it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to go in for something that might actually hurt us when we are not actually a dominant deck in terms of, like, the amount of power we can put on the board. A lot of the games with this deck are pretty close, and you're going to, like, have to make a lot of important choices. And something like a Killmonger, instead of something that has a lot of power, especially if it could negatively impact us, might not be something we could afford. I'm interested to see how this deck develops moving forward. A lot of people might be a little bit upset with the idea that discard is down here. I have long been of the opinion that this deck is not nearly as good as people act like it is. Every time I have looked at its stats in basically every cohort, there has been no evidence that this is a broken deck or anything close to it. Yet when the OTA dropped, the most prominent reactions I saw even in my own Discord were, I can't believe they didn't do something about Bullseye. I see people complaining about this deck constantly. And I've done a lot of rumination on why that is, and I think the answer is because it plays a bit like Hela. Like, this is a deck that people hate because it makes them feel helpless, not a deck that is actually broken. And I am very sympathetic to that. I am absolutely sympathetic to people who just hate doing this, because discard has a way of making you feel totally helpless. They did their thing, I didn't have my interaction, they have 85 power, I lose. And I totally understand why that's a bad feeling. But in terms of actual evidence for this, there's none. This deck has a 50% win rate at top 10% infinite right now. It has a lower than 50% win rate at top 50% infinite. It is negative cube rate at top 10% infinite. This is a deck that is such a known quantity that despite its power, I think people will have trouble winning large games with it, because everyone knows the deal at this point, and if they are going to mess you up, they will mess you up for a large amount of cubes, and if they are going to lose, they are going to leave. There is very little surprising in this list, and the better you are, the more you'll feel it. This is a deck that is perfectly playable. I personally think that those stats underrate it. But right now, when you go down to top 50% infinite, and you look at the best discard list with over 100 games, and you look at the best destroy list with over 100 games, the destroy list has a better win rate and cube rate. You can't be worse than destroy. You just can't. And I think that there is very little argument that this deck is actually broken at this point. And to be clear, I think this is the better of the two discard lists. The other one with Khonshu is an even lower point ceiling deck that is basically just as predictable. I genuinely do not think that either of these lists should be in line for a nerf moving forward. I didn't think they were incredible previously. I thought they were good. I frankly still think they're good. I think that these are still good decks, especially this one. I think it's a good deck. I think those stats are underrating it. But I definitely don't think it's broken. And I think that people need to take a deep breath and really address what their criticisms of this deck are, because if your criticisms are, I don't like playing against it, that's super valid. But I don't think there's a lot of evidence for it actually being overpowered at this point. I had a run with this list that was genuinely shocking to me. I went about 30 and 20, gained like 35 cubes in the run, and a lot of that was because 0 people expected me to play Killmonger ever. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. Like, why would you be playing Killmonger in your Kitty Pride deck that also plays Kate Bishop, that also plays Hydra Bob? Why would you do that, you idiot? And the answer is, you just have to play around your own card here. Like, it's almost the same thing as the Luke Cage versus Super Skrull thing, where it's like, look, if you're gonna die to them having a Super Skrull on you, you just don't play the Luke Cage. And it's the same thing here. Like, if you're gonna probably Killmonger them, you just don't play your 1-drops. It's okay. You can do that. This deck actually kind of wants to save those cards for later in the game anyway. You don't need to be playing for tempo. You have to actually give a lot of care towards board space at this point. If anything changed in the OTA for this deck, it was not Bishop's improvement from 1 to 2, although, it didn't hurt. What actually changed is that people started playing a lot less Rocket and Groot, and any Angela Hope Summers deck, especially Angela Hope Elsa, is going to get a lot better if that card is less seen. That is a card that is absolutely crushing against you. The person I got this list from was Derek, who was playing a Luke Cage in the Killmonger spot because that's how afraid you have to be. This is also a deck that has to be a little bit afraid of Scream. You're a mid-rangey deck that is very reliant on points. You don't really have the alternative. So because of that, that one tech slot really has to pull a lot of weight. The problem is that it also has to be cheap. You really don't want that card to be Shang-Chi or Enchantress, because those are very expensive, and it's very hard to do those in addition to playing other cards on the final turn of the game. What that means is that this deck is a deck that is winning for me mostly by catching people off guard. This is the kind of thing that I think once it becomes in more known quantity, it'll be a lot harder to catch people off guard, but for now, it has been very successful for me. Good Machine is a relatively playable deck for anyone who wants to be experimenting with the newly buffed Red Wing. Many of the things, and this is going to sound a little weird, but like many of the things that I described about when Scream is at her best, also apply to this deck because what they are representing is that the metagame has a relatively low point ceiling. I have seen almost no Mr. Negative. I have seen relatively less discard. And when that is happening in these mid-rangey metas, if the Infinite is a legitimate threat to win a lane on his own, which he is, this is a much more playable deck. Since the Infinite is a legitimate threat to win the game on his own or win a lane on his own, this is a deck that can do a lot of damage right now. There are a couple play tips that I have for you, the first of which is stop playing Ghost Spider early. Yes, it's an amazing card for Red Wing, but also when you have 7 energy, what you do a lot of the time is reposition a 6-drop on turn 7 with a Ghost Spider. It's very difficult to play around an Infinite that moves. There are a lot of sort of mid-range decks that really start to shine in metagames like this, like specifically when there is not a combo deck forcing the issue on point ceiling. Decks like this and the Hitmonkey one that we just talked about and Good Machine can all come back out of the woodwork. This is, of course, the Cook. It's the Mockingbird deck. It's the deck that plays Sasquatch. It's the deck that is desperately waiting, maybe, to see how Strange Supreme might end up. The deck is powerful, it has a large amount of point output, and a great amount of flexibility. That flexibility allows it to be customized to whatever metagame you see. Currently, there's an Enchantress in here. I think you all know why, but that can be a lot of different stuff. This is a deck that has the ability to change and morph with different metagames, but what really makes it an unplayable deck, which it is not right now, is when there is something like discard or things of that nature in the meta that it just doesn't really have solid answers for. This is a very reasonable approach to the current metagame, and I think it is a little bit underrated right now. Thors, popularized by EMA, this is another deck. Like, we are in the section of decks that are decks that exist because the point ceiling is low. And the reason the point ceiling is low is there's not a lot of discard and there's not a lot of negative. They're still decks, though. So these decks are a little bit tenuous if you're looking for something to invest in. Their power is only ever going to be as good as the ceiling of the metagame is low. We're in a relatively low power point ceiling metagame right now. There are a couple of reasons for that. There is also some exceptions, right? Like Thanos is not a low power deck, but you're playing tech cards to allow you to interact with that, right? This is a deck that takes the Sarah control standpoint towards Thanos, where you're just trying to interact with it in a meaningful way. If you want to give up on trying to beat things like discard and negative with that Mobius, you can put a Killmonger in here too. And that will make you way more favored into Thanos as well. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Sauron is the best deck in the game or anything like that, but it is an eminently playable deck that is remarkably easy to play. I find that players of almost every skill level under-index for ease of play. I think that there are a lot of people, most people, like 99% of people, that would do better with a deck that was easier and a little bit worse than they would with an optimal deck that took a lot of effort to play. This is not a commentary on everyone sucks at Marvel Snap, but it's a commentary on fatigue matters. Being easy to play matters. Spending long hours playing hard decks is a difficult thing to do, no matter how good you are. So I do think that it's reasonable to take a look at a deck like this and say, I'm just going to do something easy for once. And I think that there is something to that, and that's the reason that this deck is on here. It's a fine deck. I don't want to make it seem like it's only here because it's easy. The deck is playable. It's a reasonable enough deck. You are an Enchantress deck in an Enchantress meta that also has a lot of points in it. Very straightforward, very easy to understand why this deck works. Thing is, it's also just easy, and that should give it more points. Anyone who's watching this should probably move this up the tier list mentally just a little bit. I think this deck is pretty severely underrated right now, but I am always biased towards stuff like this. This is a deck that has a lot of inbuilt power at risk of predictability and at great risk of losing to Enchantress, hence the Cosmo. As the metagame has gotten less ongoing heavy, SuperSkrull has left a lot of decks. In fact, if you take a look at Untapped's data, the absolute worst deck at high infinite is the Doom 2099 deck that uses Doom 2099 and Spectrum, that version of the ongoing deck. Last time I checked, it was at about 43% win rate at about 740 games since the patch in top 50%, where it is the most played deck. That should discourage people from playing SuperSkrull stuff. You're really only going to see it in Thanos, and frankly, you have the ability to deal with it in Thanos with this list in a way that can be viable in the sense of, you have a Moonstone for your ongoings, which means that you're going to be able to sort of use it as a small onslaught and make it a little bit more asymmetrical than it otherwise would be, things like that. But that said, one of the major advantages this deck has is being a deck that just happens to play Luke Cage. Luke Cage is obviously an absolute monster against anyone who's playing things that afflict, and there are definitely people playing things that afflict at the moment. So this is a little bit of a metagame call, and it'll depend on what you're seeing, but I do think it's a little underrated. Mr. Negative is at the end of this tier list through no fault of his own. I personally think that he's probably a little bit better than where I'm putting him here. In fact, I think he's a lot bit better than where I'm putting him here. For me, Mr. Negative is always correlated with how many Mobii there are in a given metagame. There are very few Mobii right now. Not a lot of Mobius M. Mobius, not a lot of Owen Wilson. Wow. So this is a deck that I think is actually very, very well positioned, sneakily well positioned, a very interesting deck to play right now, in my humble opinion. I think Negative might be poised for a comeback because of the nerf to discard. However, with the nerf to discard, a lot of the reason to play Negative sort of went out the window. What Negative's role has always been is the big combo deck that beats up on the slightly smaller combo deck. So a deck like Discard that occupies a similar space to Hela, as in we have some just absolutely guaranteed wins against mid-range decks. That's what this deck is there to beat, because they will never match your output ever, ever, ever. So without people playing a ton of Discard, there's not a lot of good reasons to go in for being a Mr. Negative deck, unless it's the only combo deck left standing, and I kind of think it might be. Oops, all Thors is a fairly solid name for this archetype. I think if you're trying to play Captain Carter, this is a very, very, very solid spot to do it in. I mean, you could also just take the SuperSkrull out of Thanos and just be like, I'll play it in there, and then maybe I'll draw it less or something like that. But there is kind of a lot to be said for a strategy like this. We've talked about how powerful the tech cards are. We've talked about how relevant stuff like the general shape of, your average Shang-Chi Juggernaut deck can be, and this deck is absolutely that. I do think that this is indicative of something to me, though. It's indicative of the ways that Shang-Chi Juggernaut decks have sort of moved past Agamotto as a necessary thing in there, and I'm not sure they're right about that. Because honestly, I don't think this deck is as bad as everyone else seems to think. It just feels like everyone stopped playing it, but I don't know, you could maybe convince me that other builds of this kind of mid-range thing are a little bit better, right? You could convince me that Juggernaut is not nearly as good when people are playing Thanos decks that actually fill up the board. I believe both of those things. But how much worse is this deck actually? If we're gonna be serious about it, I just kind of don't feel like this deck is taking the hit that it should have taken. And what I mean by that is, I see very few people playing it at the top end of Infinite, and I don't know why. I think it's probably at worst a side grader, maybe the slightest of downgrades from any of the other Shang-Chi Juggernaut decks that we talked about, and as a mid-range deck, it is one of the better mid-range decks at going tall, and that is something that I think you care about in this metagame, because being a mid-range deck that goes taller than the other mid-range decks, that's how you win in those matchups. I think this deck is getting underrated right now, personally. You know what time it is. It's destroy time. Now, I will say that I think there is probably a better case for this deck than there has been in a very long time. Destroy was typically a deck that has like similar output to other decks, or at least, especially in combo heavy metagames, similar or less output than other decks. But this is a very mid-rangey metagame, and Destroy can actually just go over the top of some of this stuff. Like, there are very reasonably draws that are just stronger than a lot of these mid-range decks are able to handle. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still some problems with being a Destroy deck, right? Like, in as much as Juggernaut has gotten worse, you still hate to see it. It can really jack you up. Like, this is a deck that is predictable, it gets good draws, and when it gets those good draws, it has to invest in them, but it's also vulnerable because of its predictability and because of the actual vulnerabilities that it has to a ton of different tech cards. So this ends up being a deck that I think, for not like the first time ever, but I am actually cognizant of Destroy as an archetype. As we talked about this sort of low point ceiling and all of that, playing any kind of combo deck does feel kind of clever right now. There is one omission that I have made from this list, and it's because I'm just throwing my hands up at this point. That is, of course, Arishem. I see people play it. There's like 7 different lists. I have no idea what any of them are supposed to be doing, and I don't even think the deck is that good right now. But it's definitely good enough or better than some of the lists we've had on here, but I just don't feel comfortable opining about it because it's just such a weird deck. Like, it's just the weirdest guy to ever exist, and it tends to benefit when there are like large metagame shakeups, and it in theory should benefit from less discard and worse discard, but it just doesn't seem to have. Whenever I look at the stats for the deck, it's like, oh wow, that is not enough to make me want to play it. But I think that's sort of probably a good spot for Arishem to be in. Like, I'm sure there's something you could do with it. It's hard for that deck to ever be like bad, a poor choice, a bad choice. But it definitely doesn't have a lot of appeal to me right now. I think Thanos sort of has taken over the big deck repertoire. And in the heads up, I kind of think that if there is a reason for Arishem getting worse, it's that it's very hard for Arishem to be a tech card deck in a meaningful way because there's a bunch of cards in there. And so you have this other deck, Thanos, that is just big brothering you in terms of power output and in terms of consistency. And so you sit there as the Arishem gamer and you're like, why am I bothering to do this when they're probably cheating as much energy as me between Wiccan and Mockingbird and all their stones? What's the point of me doing this? Like, why am I taking on a risk when they just get it from stones? And it's like, yeah, that's probably the reason. All right, y'all. It has been a pleasure. I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe. As always, thank you once again for watching.